Um, I want to jump into the Parsha, but I want to do so mindful of the world and the moment that we're in. I was in a conversation with a colleague just yesterday, a colleague at UJA, and we were talking about how hard it is to figure out our communal response to everything that requires response. And we were both struggling with it. It's a hard thing to figure out how to tell the story of the moment because it's too big a story to actually be contained. And once we try to find the words, there will be something we leave out. So when yesterday I gave a quote to our team about the Jacksonville shooting, which was an anti-black racist shooting. And it turns out that the assault-style rifle, which is a very complicated thing to talk about in American culture, had a swastika emblazoned on it. And that might not be what you tuned in to hear about this morning, but it's really important for us to understand that if we don't face the world as it is, and we don't understand that the pain that Jews experience from anti-Semitism should lead us not just into a sensitivity that comes from a place of protected privilege, but actually a sense of identification with the communities that are also faced with incredible hate, because after all, it's a manifestation of hate that is too big to only face one kind of other. Any kind of hate is hate against all of us. That's what Dr. King taught us 60 years ago and before. That's what prophets like him and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught us, that the sensitivity we are called to have to our own children's welfare should be the sensitivity we have to every person's child, which is another way of saying us. How can I understand how to respond if I think that the pain is someone else's? Every experience of pain is meant to influence the way I feel and act in the world, because as Heschel taught about the soul of a prophet, prophecy lends voice to the silent agony of the world. Again, not necessarily what you tuned in to hear about, but when it comes to both destruction wreaked by human hands and then destruction amplified by human hands, like the way climate change has changed the intensity of hurricanes and what we used to call natural disasters. Well, we are natural creatures, but what we have done to this earth is hardly natural. And so for everyone in Florida, in harm's way, what an intense moment for us to take stock, both of how we need to take care of each other and how our actions in this world have ripple effects far beyond what we see. There are ways that I could point to Chapel Hill, where at the University of North Carolina just yesterday, a chemistry professor was murdered by a gunman. And if you saw the footage, students were jumping out of windows. Jumping out of windows. And I have a habit that I've had for a long time of looking through a simple Google search for the latest shootings in America. And the list was way too long. People at baseball games, teenagers in Yonkers. It's an incredible thing for us to face the world as it is and to not just struggle for hope, which is fair, but to understand that the story has been this way for a very long time. And that leads me directly into the Parsha. So I know that this is a lot to start with, and I apologize to those of us who are really starting the day together right now, because the intensity is a lot, I know. But the world is a lot. In fact, as Wordsworth said, the world is too much with us sometimes. But what's really important for us to understand is that we come from a long line of those who have retained the capacity to hope and who have retained the devotion to fighting for justice and for safety for all people. The radical claim of the Torah is that God cares about the universe. It doesn't start with the Jewish story. It starts with the world. It starts with one person, and that one person is each of us. So this is where I turn to the Parsha. And you might know these words because we recite them at the Seder. It's a strange thing. It actually comes out of context at the Seder. But we are told that we we have a history. Our ancestor, Arami Oved Avi, was a wandering Aramaean, and this comes from this week's Parsha. And so it's so important for us to understand, looking at this verse, how the different kinds of translations have influenced different experiences of the world. Now, I want to, first of all, wish an advanced Mazel Tov B'Sha'a Tova to Adrian, whose daughter will be betrothed to the most magnificent partner her family could have hoped for, a kind and caring, sweet and loving man. And it's so important for us to understand that within our families, literally within our families, we understand the diversity even when we look the same, have similar backgrounds, because there are differences in the way, let's say, we keep kosher or do the dishes or clean our rooms or the furniture we like, or there are differences. But when there are actual differences where we come from, sometimes we feel that's a bridge too hard to cross. It's one of the reasons that coming together and understanding that true human relationship means that we see through God's eyes, that we all have the same source of life pulsing through us. Arami Oved Avi has often been translated as, my father was a wandering Aramaean. And that points, we believe, to Abraham. Abraham, our ancestor, was a wandering Aramaean. That was the beginning of his life's story. But there's another translation of Arami Oved Avi, which is, an Aramaean sought to destroy my ancestor. And that is often understood to be telling the story of Lavan chasing Yaakov, our ancestor. So I want you to hear both of these and understand that the way we tell stories is incredibly important to pay attention to. Listen to both interpretations again. The phrase in Hebrew is Arami Oved Avi. I'll read a little bit more of it. Vayered Mitzrayma vayagor sham bimtei me'at vahi sham legoy gadol atzum varav. This is chapter 26, verse 5 of the book of Deuteronomy, squarely within our parsha. And we are told to say Arami Oved Avi. So either it means, my ancestor Abraham was a wandering Aramaean. Think about what that journey meant. Called by God to move forward, eventually into a land of promise. The other interpretation is, an Aramaean sought to destroy my ancestor Jacob and made his life terrible. Now, biblically speaking, both are true. Both are true. We know that the way we tell story eventually includes only some of reality. We can't tell it all every time. The way I see Judy sharing pictures of her family together in Paris and before that in England tells me that she's sharing snippets of a gorgeous, real experience. But here's something we need to remember. In every one of these places that we are, in every story that we tell, in every picture we post, there are pictures we chose not to post, or pictures we didn't choose to post, I should say. Which is true? Was Abraham a wandering Aramaean, or did Lavan try to attack Jacob? Well, the answer is yes. Both are true. And what we need to be able to do in order to navigate life forward and face the world as it is, including all of the violence, including the othering that is a different kind of violence. It's blasphemy in the eyes of God for me to see any human being as less than human. It's blasphemy. But the other way of expressing that is really important. It is incredibly holy to recognize the image of God. It is honest to despair sometimes, but it is also a sin to despair. Hope is the greatest mitzvah. And how do I use the verse that we just shared as the proof text for this idea? When, in the original context, in this week's Parsha, was a person called to recite Arami Oved Avi, not at a Passover Seder, but when we finally arrived to the land of promise and finally settled down and finally planted some vegetables and some fruit, we would take the first fruits of our harvest, the bikurim, go before the high priest, and we began with this recitation. I hold in my hands the fruit of my labor, the bounty that I begged God for, the promise that God made to my children. I hold it in my hands, and I go to the representative of the sacred, which the priest was, and I recite a small version of my history. Listen to the story. My father was a wandering Aramean. I'll just use this translation. He went down to Egypt with small numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. You might notice we skipped all the details of every story that led to Joseph not going down to Egypt, but being sold. We skipped all the details. And there in Egypt, the Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. That skips 190 years of prosperity. It jumps to the 210 years of enslavement. We cried out to God, the God of our ancestors, and God heard our plea, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. Oh, really? It happened that quickly? Or was it generations after generations of the extremes of what Adrian is pointing to, of othering? God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents. The plagues, splitting of the sea, and then bringing us, this is verse 9, to this place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. You know what was missing there? 40 years of real experiences. 40 years. 40 years of not just the good stuff. In fact, Sinai's missing from there. So much is missing when we tell our stories. So friends, I know this is a lot. Again, you tuned in early in the morning for some Torah. Well, here it is. The world that we inherit is not the world we want our children to inherit. And we can do something about that. We're only here because our ancestors did everything they could to make this world a little bit more hospitable for us. Yes, we face enormous, enormous burdens and obstacles. Yes, our children have reason for worry, and we have reason for worrying for them. But it is also important to know that we worry because we care. Therapists will always tell us that where we are uncomfortable, we are attached. And I make this joke sometimes with friends who are Buddhist. It's not fair to Judaism or Buddhism what I'm about to say. But if one of the central principles of Buddhism is that attachment leads to suffering, Judaism says, no, attach. Because suffering means I'm experiencing the world with its harsh edges and committing myself, as we do, as we must, as Judaism calls us to do, and in this month of Elul, as we each individually must do as we prepare for a world reborn. We have to do the kind of refining and reflecting so that we can be a part of the great reemergence of a more dream-worthy world. Our children deserve that. We deserve that. This world is not in great shape, but it's never been in great shape, even when it was first created. So what I want to bless us with, friends, is a sense of both endurance, because that's important, responsibility, because that is important, and also we are connected to this trajectory that now I've been talking about for a while, from ancient times, when our ancestors brought the first fruits to the priest in Jerusalem. After wandering for 40 years, they told a partial history. And the reason why they told a partial history is because that's all I can handle right now. I'm going to give you some of what's going on. I'm going to tell my children some of what's going on. I'm going to recite before God the journey as I recall it mindfully today. So, this is the blessing. Let's be strong enough to tell our stories. Let's bless our children by channeling all the wisdom we've gained through personal experience on their behalf, for their sakes. As Ron said, that's the right way to end this conversation for now. We must build this world from love. All right, friends, let's go into a good day. Bless you, friends. See you tomorrow.